Hello and welcome to Autistic FM. My name is Haya. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm your host on this journey. Today, I'm thrilled to have with us Myk, one of my favorite humans on the internet. His Twitter feed was originally the inspiration for this podcast. I basically went, hey, I would love to interview him, but I don't really have a podcast to do that on. So, 33 episodes later, and he's finally here. In this episode, we navigate the unique intersection of neurodiversity and philosophy. Myk brings a wealth of personal experience and thought leadership to our conversation, especially as somebody who's discovered their autism and ADHD later in life. You can subscribe to Autistic FM wherever you get your podcasts, and it would be kind of awesome if you did. That's how we grow and that's how we thrive. Over on our website at autistic.fm, you can find episode transcripts and additional information about each episode. We also have discussion threads for each individual episode, a neurospicy discussion forum, and much, much more. And all of that is free. If you become a supporter for as little as $5 a month, you can get a sneak preview of the topics we have coming up and even submit questions to our guests. You can also add topics to our future topics wish list, and you get access to a supporters-only discussion group. We have a bunch of additional supporter treats coming up, so stay tuned. I do want to add a quick trigger warning. We discuss topics like autism and ADHD diagnoses, experiences of autistic burnout, mental health challenges, and spiritual awakenings. Please look after yourself and listen accordingly. With all of that out of the way, let's roll the tape. Hello and welcome back to Autistic FM. I am joined today with a guest who, in a weird roundabout kind of way, actually inspired this podcast series. So here we are 30 episodes in and I finally get to talk to you. Wonderful human. Would you share your name, your pronouns, and where in the world you are, please?
Yeah, my name's Myk Bilokonsky. My pronouns are he, they, Myk. Me, I'm currently in Columbus, Ohio in the United States.
Wonderful. I am usually in the United States, but I'm currently in the Caribbean because I desperately needed a break. So hence this slightly different setup than usual. Myk, what was your relationship with autism and neurodivergence, and where do you fit in on this spectrum?
Yeah, I learned at the ripe old age of 35, having hit massive autistic burnout, that I was autistic and ADHD, both of which came as a bit of a shock to me. That was 7 years ago now. And so I did the thing that so many of us do, where I made neurodiversity into an ad hoc special interest and learned everything I could, and then thought about it real hard because so much of what I was finding didn't quite work, didn't add up. And I recognized that one of the reasons it took me 35 years to figure out that this was true about me is that I had never actually seen a relatable description of what it means to be autistic anywhere. I had a bunch of biases and assumptions, like everybody does, that are trying to describe autism from the outside, and I had never accurately seen myself reflected in that. And so I started writing about it, and I created a subreddit, Autism Translated, where the goal was to represent what it is to be autistic in a way that people could see themselves in. And I'm not very active there anymore, but to this day, it's like one of the most wholesome places on Reddit that I'm aware of. There's tens of thousands of people there supporting each other through diagnosis and self-acceptance and all that. And I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, beautiful. That is totally worth being proud of, not least because I didn't know you were behind that, but it's one of the Reddits I really love. So thank you for making it. I'm curious, you said it came as a bit of a surprise. Like, what were the steps that happened where you actually ended up to a realization/diagnosis?
So my autistic origin story is really sad, actually, and it's not a pleasant story. It was a really jarring discovery for me because it was like a few months after I'd gotten married, and we had been traveling internationally for months. I had not had a fixed home address for 8 months at that point. And I was starting to go a little bit nuts in ways I couldn't quite understand. I was getting really stressed out. And now I recognize not having a stable home base, that's something that's like dysregulating for me. But at the time, I didn't know what was going on. And I was trying to figure out, what is this, right? And somehow I stumbled upon an essay written by somebody who was describing the nightmare that it is to realize that you've married an autistic person. And as I read this essay, I'm checking all of these boxes in my head of these are all of the things, literally all the things that I've been terrified that people would perceive me as doing. But wow, seeing all of this lined up, like this is everything that I've been terrified that I would be perceived as. And you're telling me that's autism.
Do you have an example or two of the kind of things that were on that list?
Oh gosh, I feel like I've blocked it out, but it's stuff like...
I don't want to re-traumatize you. We can also just skip ahead if you want to.
So, I mean, I don't remember specifically, but I can like extrapolate that it would be things like argumentative for no reason, right? Things like doesn't care about other people's emotional needs or doesn't have empathy. Like the whole no empathy thing just drives me nuts because, as I'm sure so many of us, myself included, are like hyper empathic, but the ways that manifests often are not very well aligned with societal expectations. And so you end up jammed up, and that then gets perceived as like not caring about other people when the problem is that you care too much. I felt like somebody had captured in a page the worst possible caricature of me, and it was presented in a way that made me realize, oh shit, that's what's going on. And so I started...
Or at least as an external perception of what's going on.
Yeah, I have these traits that are being perceived in this way. I guess I need to learn what autism is. And so I just spent a night like crying and reading and feeling seen for the first time because I'd sought out descriptions from autistic people to be autistic. And that began like a real period of passionate discovery and advocacy for me.
Yeah. I recognize that so strongly. It's like reading a novel. Wait a minute, somebody cast me in this novel without my consent, but also, holy hell, what is going on? It's powerful, but also the realization I had is, oh, my entire universe is a lie, which was a scary and powerful thing. You're staring into a mirror for the first time kind of thing. Oh, that's what I look like.
Yeah, for me, there was this sort of like halting, terrified process of self-acceptance over a course of a couple months. And then like a bunch of really bad stuff happened, massive stressors, at the end of which I had a moment where I went to reach for the energy that I used to mask and just be agreeable and do the thing. And there was nothing there. And I didn't know that energy could be depleted. It's like the horror movie moment of my life is realizing, no, I can't run out of that. I can't communicate. How do I work? How do I get along with people? How do I talk to friends? How do I like get through the day without this energy that I've been drawing on? And that became like the worst period of my life. I was having multiple meltdowns a day, every day for a year. I was going to neurologists, psychologists. What's wrong with me? Can somebody help me understand? And everybody's telling me you're fine. And I'm like,
doesn't feel fine. What's going on?
I used to be able to do all this, and now I can't. Like, I can't play video games, right? My head hurts if I try to think about my next turn in civilization. And that's when I discovered and learned about autistic burnout, right? And recognized what was happening to me. There are no social scripts for this, right? Nobody that you try to explain this to has a referent. You can tell them in whatever ways you're able to through that fog. You can try to describe what's going on, but they have nothing to use to ground or understand what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
And it's the most alienating and horrifying thing. I like to talk about how there's like little lowercase b burnout and uppercase b burnout, right? And many of us go through life bouncing between lowercase b burnouts, and then we take a week and recover or whatever and mostly bounce back. But nobody warns you about the capital B burnout that is eventually waiting for you, from which you don't bounce back. You will simply not be the same person anymore.
Dude, I feel you. Thank you for sharing that. I always had this visual. If people could see me, if people realize the monster I am, I will never be accepted by anyone. You have this carefully crafted projection, and that, you know, that little power plant that powers that, if the projection falls, and that was the pandemic for me. I caught COVID and my central processing unit was limping along at 10%, and I couldn't function. Like, the only way I got by was through the kindness of some neighbors and online deliveries that kept me alive. All of which is to say is that there's a lot of parallels in our story, and in a way that is reassuring to me, right? Nobody's telling these stories, but hearing this, and the people listening to the podcast, the ones who have had this particular strain of autism, shall we say, will recognize that too. And I think just hearing you talk so openly and vulnerably about your experience is going to help a bunch of people. So thank you.
Thanks. I find it's interesting because in recent years I've moved back to my home state and reconnected with a bunch of people that I used to be close with. It's really funny. The people that I was closest with all tell me the same story. There's something happened in my 30s where I couldn't function anymore. And we start to talk about it. And sure enough, when I start talking about, what do you know about autism, right? I now recognize that the people that I bonded with intuitively growing up are like me.
I think the thing that happened for me was that most of my friends were neurotypical, but I had a few like incredibly intense friendships that
Yeah.
kind of fizzled. And I don't even like thinking back on it now. I had one friend where we'd sit in the back of my dad's station wagon and talk about absolute bollocks, like anything that sprung into our minds for hours. And we would just talk and talk. And like I'm not a talky kind of person, but somehow with this one human, and then our friendships fizzled, and I've barely ever thought about him ever again. And there's been a number of those over the years. And now, checking back in with some of them, yeah, they're all deep spectrum. So it's interesting.
It's funny the way those relationships tend to fizzle too, because something I've really come to understand is that when you're undiagnosed and you're high masking, there's like nobody who's more contemptuous of an autistic person than a high masking autistic person who doesn't know that they're autistic, right? And so there's this deep self loathing in both sides of the friendship. And every once in a while, something happens where you see something in them that reminds you of the thing that you're afraid of in you. And you're just, whew, can't be around this anymore.
Yeah. And what I hope is true is that is a thing of the past. I was born in the early 80s, and I hope that the kids who are born like 20 years ago now have a very different experience because of more awareness, because of all this kind of stuff. And that gives me hope.
I think some do, but I think that with the growing awareness has been growing pushback. And just look at all the news, all the social media discussion about autism since RFK has come out with
Right.
his nonsense, right? All the people who have such strong opinions who speak as if it's just self-evidently true that there are all these fake autistic people running around. That social pressure is killing people. It's literally killing people. And it's different from nobody knows, nobody talks about it. It's now actively get back under your mask or you're going to be
Right.
punished, right?
It feels like there's a really strong parallel around identity politics in general. If you are bisexual, say, you can cosplay straight pretty straightforwardly just by not engaging with the same gender. And there's so many different expressions of identity that you can mask by just acting like the normcore kind of streak. And I think the truth is that for most people, that is harmful. If you are gay and you're like, I can't be gay because that will be harmful to me, so I'm going to figure out how to be straight, to use the sexual version of this. But I think a lot of autistic people are just cosplaying neurotypical, which is what masking essentially is. But that mask catches up with you in a really brutal way. And I think that's a full circle back to your note about burnout.
Yeah, I spent a couple of years working as a neurodiversity coach. I'm not doing this much anymore, but there's something very specific that I came to understand. And I'll share this story here. Do you know Tara Vance with Neuroclastic? So she's got an article on her site where she talks about something she refers to as identity masking. It's the difference between I'm going to mask for this interaction to stay safe as something I'm doing tactically versus I just mask all the time and I don't even know who's under the mask. And I read this as I was undergoing a sort of personal awakening after some real difficult times. I'd been doing IFS therapy for a few years, and I had this moment where I felt an intrusive thought coming on. And this is after, I don't want to get into what it was after, but like after a lot of effort that didn't work out, and like some difficult life circumstances. And I felt this intrusive thought coming on as I was standing there heating up some canned soup, feeling sorry for myself. And I'm thinking like, oh, great. fresh hell am I about to unleash on myself, bracing myself. And I heard a voice I'd never heard before tell me, I just want you to know that I saw everything. And I'm so proud of you. You tried so hard. You never gave up. And I know that right now it's very difficult for you to be proud of yourself, but I know that you will be. And I said, who the fuck are you and how did you get in here? What? And I started having an interaction, an ongoing conversation with this voice. And I'm not somebody who's ever had plural experiences. I'm not somebody who at that point had any kind of spirituality, but this voice in my head knew answers to questions that I didn't know the answer to. It knew what to say. It knew things I didn't know. And I talked to it for 3 days as I was trying to navigate some very painful life circumstances. And I'm like, am I talking to God? Did I parentify my inner child? What is going on here? And on the third morning, I woke up and I was crying and I was confused about something. And I asked it this question. What I remember is that suddenly the whole world turned inside out. And I was being asked that question by an exhausted part of myself. And I realized I knew the answer. It was not a difficult question. And I answered that part and I told it it could rest. And then I'm sitting there in bed and I realize for the first time in my life, I know who I am. Transcendental breakthrough. I realized that I had been living my life in my head, that I had been trying to answer questions like, who am I, by thinking about them. And in that moment, I suddenly realized, no, that answer is here. I know, like, I am that answer. I have access to the whole thing. I'm not just this part. And so it was in that frame of mind when I stumbled upon Tara's essay about identity masking. And she's talking about when you don't know who you are under the mask, there's all this real pathological, harmful stuff that can happen to you, to the people around you, because you're like unstable in certain ways. Like it's very difficult to build a life in that way. And until I had this breakthrough, I couldn't have answered the question of who am I under the mask. I only knew the mask. And so I built on her work and started offering coaching, where the approach I took was, look, it's really funny. Autistic people get this reputation of being hyper rational, right? We're very oriented around facts. We want to think through the whole thing. Is that all a coping strategy?
That's a really good question. And my
Because
suspicion is that a lot of the really important things in life cannot be answered in that realm.
you can't. I just read this hilarious little blurb on Twitter about Wittgenstein, who had a moment in his life when his rationality collapsed and he refused his inheritance and moved to a monastery to tend the garden. And all of his friends started to distance themselves from him because he started to become a mystic. And I'm sitting here laughing, like, that's the most autistic arc I've ever seen.
Right.
We use cognition to bridge the gap between ourselves and everybody else. And when we do that, we silence our connection to our own body because nothing it tells us is helpful. It's only ever trying to tell us that something is disconnected, that there's an unmet need, da da da. But whenever I listen to my body and try to get that met, I face social consequences. And so I just wall that off and I become this creature of rationality. And my only goal becomes avoiding shame. That's the only metric that I use, and I optimize for it. And then I become somebody in my 20s and 30s who's really good at abstract reasoning and predicting the behavior of other people and running a simulation of the whole damn universe in my head all the time, and I don't know who I am. And the number of people I've spoken to who I've outlined this for and who've just looked at me like, holy shit, right? This is the autistic trauma. It's the retreat into the cognitive frame. It is the loss of the ability to trust and then to even hear what the body is saying.
Yeah.
And when you meet an autistic person who has reconnected to their body, they're so weird. They're so great. They're just like, in tune, they're relaxed. They're not. I had a spiritual awakening as a part of all this, where if you told me that 3 years ago, I'd be like, come on.
Yeah. Yes. If you live purely in the land of thought for long enough, then whatever trauma exists in your body just builds up and becomes this powder keg, right? The body keeps the score thing. That score is tallying underneath all of that. And for me, the only way I had connection to my body was sexually. That was the only time I was like in my body, like in connection with others. But it turns out sexuality touches, I'm blessed that I have no trauma in the sexual realm, but like all the other stuff, it was like my somatic experience was incredibly one-dimensional and purely in the sexual realm. And once that door got opened into, oh God, I had a series of epic meltdowns because when I finally invited my body to speak, my body was like, oh, I've got some shit to say to you, friend.
Yeah. Here's 35 years of repressed emotional pain. Good luck.
And it's like the temptation to quickly slam that door shut again is huge because, and that's the journey I think I am starting to come out the other side of now. And it's been epically brutal. I know you don't do the coaching a lot anymore, but just to plug that for a second, we've had a coaching session together, which has come up, like strands from that has been life-changing for me. So thank you for that. And if anybody's listening, highly recommended. Because this, I feel like the skill you have is by being enormous brain that has also got a foot in the spiritual and a foot in the somatic and a foot in the psychological and philosophical and all these kind of things, your pattern cognition in all of that means that you can draw parallels to all the things that maybe I haven't seen. And not everything you said landed, but the stuff that did, oh boy, did it land. It was pretty extraordinary.
The coaching was such an interesting experience because there were people that I couldn't get through to. Nothing I said, and I watched as nothing I said landed. I'm not blaming myself for that or whatever. But there were people who I'd have one conversation with them and then hear 6 months later that I changed their life and fixed everything. And what I came to understand is that there's no way to communicate the transcendental insight. All you can try to do is set up the dominoes so that enough of them are in place that when one of them goes, it brings down the entire scaffolding. And that's a really interesting challenge. Also, it leads to things like, okay, I helped this person get out of their brain. Did I prepare them for what's coming?
But the truth is, I don't think you can. I think people who are fully in their brain have no idea what happens. And it's like you have 5 pillars. One of them is load-bearing. And you can chop away at a non-load-bearing one your entire life and get nowhere. And then you like flick the load-bearing one and the whole house comes tumbling down. That was my experience. Somebody just had to ask me the right question and everything came down. And it was the beginning of an excruciating year, like excruciating. And I think I'm a much more better integrated person for it. But the journey of getting here has been, like I say, I'm on holiday right now. I'm in recovery right now from that year. It's like I am reading books and meeting fish underwater. But yeah, it's been the most painful year I have experienced in a very long time.
I think that one of the reasons recovery is so hard is that we resist it so much because we intuitively understand, wait, if I knock down this pillar, I go away. The thing that I think I am is gone.
And that's such an identity, right? Like you are the god of your identity because you created it. But the truth is you can't create your own identity in that way. You can try, and many of us do try and are pretty successful for a pretty long time.
But then what you're doing is acting as the demiurge, creating like this false reality over top of, there's actually already something there. Right. And if you try to bury it, it will try to come out and you will live with this confusing cycle of tension and meltdowns and whatever, because you're repressing a whole ass being. Yesterday was Easter. I'm not a Christian, but I have come to deeply appreciate the story, which repeats in all the different mythic frameworks, of the God that has to die so that something better can emerge, right? Spirit can't enter the world until the human thing ends. And from Jesus to Young to William Blake, everybody who starts to see it starts to try to gesture at it. And like the terrible truth is, yeah, you have to allow yourself to be destroyed. And you have to have faith that there's a reason for that. And my all-time favorite symbol for this, did you ever watch Doctor Who?
Mm-hmm.
When David Tennant's run ends, he's been like irradiated, right? And he knows he's got like minutes to live. And Donna's, it's okay, you're going to regenerate. And David Tennant, who's this jolly, happy, delightful character, just gets this look of utter anguish on his face. And he says, oh, sure. Another man walks away with my memories. I'm just like, that healing doesn't feel good. It feels like dying.
Yeah.
And you still got to do it if you want to be free.
Totally. And in the world of the tarot, the death card isn't death. It is transmutation, it's change, it's evolution, it's restarts.
And this is why I think so often the spiritual awakening comes with the trauma recovery, because I realize that I am not the ego, not the story that I thought I was. That story ends and somehow I'm still here. What's my nature then? And it leads to questions that have very complex answers.
Yeah, and I think this is in an interesting way where in psychedelics, if you ever experience ego death, I had an experience recently where I experienced full-on ego death, full-on feeling oneness with the universe, where there was no drugs involved. It was in a ritual, but there were no drugs involved. And I pulled myself out of it because I was like, what the? And I was like, oh no, I have been here before. I've experienced this in the world of psychedelics, but this is this without that. It's like, okay, I'm going to see if I can go back there because I know I am not in danger. This is not a dangerous place to be for me because I know the I that I'm talking to here will be able to return. And I went back and I dropped into that ego death and allowed myself to experience it and feeling the oneness of the room and feeling the oneness of it. And it was a deeply spiritual experience. And it was done in the context of, actually, I'll tell that story another time. It's very weird. But I'm just saying it touches very deep humanity in the moment where I feel at one with the universe. I'm like, oh, wait, when I tap into source, when I tap into that piece of me that knows that I am one with everything, the erasure of the ego is what makes me, which is a weirdly complex and paradoxical thing to experience. But when I came back out of that, I was exhausted, but I was also like, I felt more at peace than I had in a very long time.
That's, yeah. I got close to there once without any kind of psychedelics. I was doing River Kenna's Somatic Resonance course. Mm-hmm. And it was 4 days of guided somatic meditation and spend half an hour really thinking about what it feels like, getting to know my left foot. I was trying so hard to enter into this sort of psychedelic state that I know was in there somewhere, but I couldn't find it. And then at the end of the last session we were doing, River's, okay, start coming up when you're ready. And in the space between him saying that and a minute later when I sat up, I suddenly went somewhere. I had the most vivid, brightly colored, psychedelic visual experience of my body as a universe where every part of it was in community with all the other parts, and where the thing that was me wasn't as... What even is a me? Right? It's all just recursive processes all the way down, and you get attached to a certain frame. And learning to become frame agnostic, when I talk about spirituality, I mean, it's more than that. It's also going and having a conversation with the river and figuring out what it means to go have a conversation with the river and have that be meaningful. And yeah, I don't know. It's just the world is so much bigger and stranger and...
But you kind of have to be open to it, right? I have this really deeply felt sense that I am, like, my very firmly held worldview right now is that there's only one soul and that it's doomed to relive every life. So you and me, same soul, just different shifts in the timeline kind of thing. But at the same time that we are an infinite recurring fractal, where all of me contains all of you and all of you contains all of me. And even as that's coming out of my mouth, like I have this little alarm bell going in the back of my head going, this is hippie bullshit. What's going on right now? But I'm like, no, I've got to accept that somewhere in this language, and language is incredibly imprecise, this is the best language I can put around my experience. And whether it's fractals or whether it's the soul doesn't actually really matter.
It's what the language is pointing at, right? It's like
Yes.
Bruce Lee says, I'm pointing at the moon, stop looking at my finger, look at the moon.
Yeah.
The language cannot contain it because language is left brain. Language is order and structure, and the thing that we're gesturing at can't be reduced to mere fact, right? It's not that kind of thing. For me, I very much have the sense that I am like a video game character and that there's a player, and I'm aware of the gaze of that player. If I think about my experience of being me, right? I've always been aware of the gaze of that player, but I recently took some time to really, I was reading Jung and I'm like reading William Blake, and okay, so here's my consciousness, right? And I know that I'm associating myself with it, but I also know that there's an unconscious that's also me, that is upstream of this thing that I seem to think that I am. But then I also have a sense of, it's almost like if you're thinking of like a giant spyglass, right? Down here near the front lens is like my conscious experience, and then that looks out onto the world. Further up the tube is all the unconscious stuff, but I'm aware of the eye that's looking from the base of the tube outward. And it's, again, language fails. But like the thing that occurs to me, or that I have this intuitive sense of, is that eye has never blinked. It has never changed. It is in certain ways very eternal. It doesn't have mutable properties. And so I wonder if that I am trying to apprehend, I wonder if that I in me is the same as that I in you. Like literally the same. So from there, I was tweeting about this like last year, and somebody was like, oh, you need to read about Hindu spirituality. And I'm like, okay, they have terms for all of this, actually. Their constructs are way more complex, but they're this, okay. It's just so, what does it mean? Fuck if I know, right? Like, it doesn't change anything is the funny part of like spiritual awakening. But it's like there's like more rooms in this house that I've been living in than I knew about. And I can go there when I want to. And that's cool.
I think in a way it's like having a shamanic practice. What is the line I have to that eye? Like, how can I speak back to the person who is observing or maybe driving or whatever that whatever the verb is there? What is my line to that?
What's my relationship?
And to me, that is a form of shamanism. This is the act of finding the rituals, the ways of communing with that.
Yeah, so I spent a long time really reluctant to look into shamanism because it felt culturally appropriative. White dude in the US, I don't want to step out of my lane. But more and more, it kept coming up as I was exploring myself. And finally, I had the thought, I'm descended from Ukrainians. I wonder, were there Ukrainian shamans? Oh, the
turns out
civilization was basically run by a shamanic caste of genderqueer stoners who sat around housing THC and playing D&D in order to make collective decisions. Wait a second.
This is what I'm doing now.
So like I start reading about shamanism more broadly, and the thing that jumps out is, I don't care who you are or where you're from. If you go far enough back in your personal lineage, you're going to find a nomadic human civilization, tribal, whatever, loosely affiliated, pre-imperial, where you had your hunters and your gatherers or whatever, but you also had the genderqueer stoners who lived on the fringe of the village, didn't really get along with anybody, and knew shit they shouldn't.
This is my autistic forefathers who knew what they were doing. Yeah, and I think the truth is humans, I agree what you're saying about cultural appropriation, right? There are rituals and there are things that maybe don't appropriate them. And at the same time, humanity, as the creatures we are, has always been asking questions. If you go down Norse mythology or other mythology or religion, like the thing they have in common is trying to make sense of a world that doesn't make sense and trying to explain things that they can't explain. And on the surface level, that is science. And that piece is actually boring because That part, scientists are pretty much better at than religious people. But then there's the underlying stuff where science go, I don't fucking know how any of this stuff works. And they're like okay with that. And I feel like that sense of being okay with not being able to explain everything, that is where shamanism and spirituality actually comes into its own. Divination, conversations.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, right? Because to somebody who's still stuck in the cognitive prison, who's got the scientific materialist worldview, right? They might be listening to this conversation and they'll be like, yeah, okay, you can say that, but I can talk to this shaman over here and this shaman over here, and they're going to give me two totally different origin stories for the universe.
Right.
And I think that the real liberating move is to recognize that a materialist scientific truth, we call that a fact. If you accumulate a bunch of facts and you want to evaluate your conclusion, you just run them through the fact checker and you figure out, is this logical or not, right? But a spiritual truth is like an emotional truth. It can contradict itself and often does. It's bigger than a fact. It can't be reduced down to a set of facts. Mm-hmm. And so to somebody who's trapped in the rationalist frame, emotions, let alone spiritual stuff, it starts to feel like noise, because every time you take it seriously, you try to run it through your fact checker and it just gunks up the gears. And
you just inspired something really powerful in me. It's like what you're describing is cognitive dissonance, right? The idea of holding two opposing thoughts at the same time. What I haven't heard much about, but is a very common experience, is somatic dissonance. You have two feelings that are like, I am jealous of you, but I also love you, and I want the best for you, but I also want what you have. All of those feelings can happen at the same time and often do. And I feel like if you're in a fact-driven world where facts make sense, which so many of us are, like having to live in the emotions, which is fucking chaotic, is painful because it's so confusing and you can't pin it down. And that's, for me, that is often where my meltdowns come from. I'm feeling two things at once that are like, I understand what these feelings are, maybe, but I can't feel them at the same time. This makes no sense.
Because you have internalized the idea that dissonance needs to be reconciled.
Yes.
But what you get from somatic integration is the recognition that I am the reconciliation of these dissonant experiences.
Yeah.
I don't need to further break them down. I contain multiple competing, seemingly incompatible truths. They're all true. I'm experiencing all of them at once, and that's fine. I can put down the calculator. There's no amount of processing or whatever that I can do to resolve this dissonance. And if I try, I'm going to spin myself out.
Yeah, 100%.
I like your comment about science being very good at science, but also being boring. William Blake wrote exactly this 200 years ago. He talks about how he has 4 kinds of sight. The first one is the one he does with his eyes. That one's great. It has the unique property that if I see it, you see it too, and we can do things with that. It's also the least interesting one. He says, everybody else who's not captured by the Enlightenment understands that imagination is where the spirit world lives. That's where you go to talk to the angels and demons and gods and monsters and myths. They're all there. You can just go talk to them. But the Enlightenment has you thinking that they're not real because you're not seeing them with these eyes. Why do you think that? You're still experiencing it. Why would you sacrifice your experience? There is value there. It's not a contradiction. It just can't be independently verified by somebody else because you can't share those experiences. That's fine. That's not how this site works.
But just to pause you there for a second, there's a really scary thing there as an autistic person, which is that I often find myself second guessing stuff because I get gaslit a lot. Because my experience, even in the first sight, like I can see the thing, but everybody says that what I'm seeing isn't what is happening. That is crazy making. But then there is a universe here where once you go into the imaginary, like nobody can confirm, but also nobody can deny what I'm seeing. And I feel like a lot of us are in such a state of, I don't trust my own judgment, because often, it seems like you had a thought. What was that thought?
Oh, no, you're spot on. That's exactly it. Because you get taught from childhood that your own judgment is incorrect, you develop a need for external validation. And so in the presence of a domain where external validation is impossible, it's like you're waiting for permission to have the experience that you're already having. You're having it. It doesn't work like other things. And so this is where I think it's very interesting, and the connection to like cultural appropriation comes in shamanism, right? Because shamans all over the world have way more in common than you might expect. Like the concept of shaman sickness, where the person with shamanic potential reaches a certain point in their life where they break and they can't get out of bed and they're sick. And if they recover, they come back having come into their powers. That's just autistic burnout. That's just
Right.
like, for fuck's sake, right?
I see you, Gandalf the White.
Yeah, right? And where the traditions differ is that every culture that practices shamanism has their own unique set of symbols, their own unique set of, here's how you interpret what happens in the spirit world, right? If you meet this kind of thing, follow it. If you meet this kind of thing, come back right away, right? So like they create a cultural container where that validation gets preloaded. And the cultural container used by like a shaman in like an Andean rainforest is very different from the container used by a shaman in Siberia. It's very different from what somebody sitting in Ohio as a white grandchild of immigrants in 2025 is going to have. So that connection to validation and to other people basically saying, yes, I have seen what you've seen, and we do have a shared language for talking about it. That's what indigenous cultures have, that those of us who are rediscovering this now, we don't.
Right.
And that's interesting and problematic and liberating in some ways, right? But also it speaks to the need to connect and ground in something, right? And this is why if you talk to people who are real serious about this stuff, magic, occult practitioners, whatever, they're always telling you got to be careful. You need a teacher. You need to be in community. You can't just believe everything. Don't go making agreements with the entities that you talk. Like, there are real dangers there, and they're not the kinds of dangers that I can tell you about. The kind of danger is different. And I find that so fascinating. It's because we get gaslit out of being able to trust ourselves, we're not even able often to take those first steps into that world. Maybe there's value in experiencing this.
Yeah, totally. And I think some of the places that this has shown up for me is that there's a couple of contexts where I have a very high degree of mastery without any learning. One of the places this comes up is Tantra. And so like the energetic exchange, where I have very few experiences with it. But whenever I do, people who I sit across from are like, holy hell, what just happened? I was like, look, I just choose to believe that I understand what's going on. And I choose to say that I know how to channel or ground these energies. And that's all I'm doing. And somewhere deep in there, there is a intuitive being that knows how to do this. And I don't know where that came from. I have no training. I have no practice. Like every time I have that experience, I'm like, I really want to learn about this. And then life gets in the way again. But I feel like this is, I don't want to rabbit hole on the telepathy tapes, but I think the interesting piece that happened with the telepathy tapes was that there was a possibility opened for the mystic and the possibility that autistic folks have a path to the mystic or to the shamanic that is, instead of doing the whole, hey, I'm having a experience of God through the church. No, I have a direct experience to source. And I feel like with a lot of people who choose to say, look, I'm going to intuit my way through this, as you say, there's real danger there, because if you don't know what you're doing, you could really hurt yourself. But intuitive knowledge is incredibly deep and incredibly powerful in all animals and in humans in particular.
I 100% agree with this. It's almost like a common trope, right? This people describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. That phrase took on an entirely new set of meanings for me in the last couple of years, where I fundamentally understand now, like the church, religion, that is empire coming in and colonizing the spirit world, which is all of our birthright. William Blake was always going on about is he posited that there must have been a primordial religion that existed before the church, where everybody was free to commune with spirits, and where people were just free to share their experiences. And sure, maybe some people would be more in tune with it than others, but like you wouldn't have priests. And he thought maybe it's the Druids. And then he learned more about the Druids and was like, oh, no, look, priests, temples, human sacrifice. This is just a separate kind of priest. And he never learned about shamanism. But like when you're reading these diary entries, it's, oh, buddy, I wish I could tell you about here. Oh, you're not going to believe this.
I've got this book you need to read.
Yeah. And that one of my favorite genres of like pop culture are the movies that are about teaching you to get in touch with the intuitive thing that you don't realize you already know. Like the Matrix trilogy is scripture about this, right? But like another one that I really deeply love is Into the Spider-Verse, where Miles is, oh, okay, I can be Spider-Man? Cool. Who's going to teach me how to be Spider-Man? Let me try Peter Parker. This isn't really working. Gwen, can you teach me? And he looks to everybody but himself, and he becomes a liability. And they tie him up and leave him there when they go off to save the day. And he's alone in the room, and he finally realizes there's literally nobody else. So maybe I can trust myself. He allows himself to believe in his own intuition.
Yeah.
It has my favorite shot in 21st century cinema, right? Which is when he gets the suit and he jumps off the Empire State Building, takes the leap of faith, and the shot inverts so that as he's falling, he's rising and becoming transcendent. That shit, there's a reason that myths are a thing. Like, this is another thing William Blake wrote about it. I love talking about Blake. He wrote until his dying day. And there's a journal entry from his friend as I tried to tell William, rest, put the pencil down, man. You're sick. You need to take it easy. And Blake says, nothing I've ever made is sold. You think I want to sell this? No, man. The spirits told me that in a couple hundred years, the Enlightenment is going to end. And people who speak English are going to be fucked because we destroyed all of our myths. And they're going to think that myth is something that the Greeks did. The spirits told me I need to do my work so that I can teach people in the future generations how to relate to spirit. And I'm sitting there reading this, like, just sobbing. I'm like, what the fuck?
Yeah. I love the populations who are able to have a really light, casual relationship with the spiritual that runs in parallel with everything else they do. Like in Iceland, the belief that elves exist is, yeah, of course they do. Next topic. It's not up for debate. We're not going to talk to you about this. Of course they exist. Next. It just runs deep. And a lot of the people that kind of identify as witches in my life, they have a spiritual practice around the moon cycles or the whatever. And I've had the privilege of being part of some of those ceremonies and rituals. And I love that you don't have to go all in mystic or all in monk or all in whatever. I love we get to do our thing, but we get to also be, like, humans are complex. We don't have to be single, like, one-dimensional in this either. And I think we forget so easily.
And it's because the world is constantly trying to collapse us into market segments, right? Like, our culture is constantly reducing things into as few dimensions as possible. And it's such a revolution to recognize I can trust my body even if nobody tells me whatever, even if it contradicts itself. I can accept the dissonance as how this works. I can disagree with myself. I can give you two different answers to the same question.
Yeah.
I can use a calculator, write some code, talk to that tree, draw a painting. I don't owe anybody a single coherent worldview, actually. Where did I get that old idea that I did?
And I think this is the challenge that I am experiencing because I don't have any role models for people who do that, or I have too few. Like, everybody is one-dimensional because that's how they project themselves. That's their mask. I am business executive, or I am this, or I am that. Okay, why are you defined by your job or by your whatever? There's a rich and full human being in every human being. And for most of them, I don't get to see that. And that makes sense because I'm not their close confidant.
But often I think even their close confidants don't. I figured out where to find my mentors. They're Dostoevsky and James Joyce and Virginia Woolf and like all of the great autistic writers of history who have been screaming this shit from the rooftops for centuries. read Ulysses, right? And that's going to give you all of the complexity of the human experience. Read like 100 Years of Solitude, right? Read The Idiot. All of these people are trying to say we're not reducible. And when we try to reduce ourselves into something coherent, we lose something. And sometimes it's okay to choose to lose something in service to coherence, but don't assume you always have to.
And I think lose is a powerful and binary word. I'm curious if there is a focus instead. Like, you don't have to always focus on everything. You can put something inside and say, hey, I know this part of me exists. I don't have the energy for it right now, but it still gets to exist. Like, I'm not going to water that part of the garden for a few days, or a few weeks, or a few years.
Leopold Bloom loses his son in childhood in Ulysses, and that is a part of why he is the person he is. You can't disentangle any of it. I think a lot about, we never even really got into the philosophy stuff, but I'm a sucker for Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching and the concept of yin and yang, which I never really fully understood before, but I think I do now. And it's about this idea that in any given process, there is everything else that is acting on that process. And then there is the thing that is unique to that process that is pushing back against everything else. It is the part that asserts that the unfolding is going to go a different way than it otherwise would. So yin is like that unfolding. It's just the passive, everything happens. Yang is the assertion that we're going to bend fate or whatever. And I think that often Bilokonsky talks about left hemisphere capture, right? Left hemisphere is like the yang side of the brain. It imposes order, it changes things. And the idea is that we live in a society that has started to impose order over everything at the expense of being able to even hear what would have happened otherwise. We assume that like high agency changing reality is the thing to do, but then we don't listen, and we can never have the full scope for our actions. And that's how you end up with things like climate collapse, right? Everybody's just changing things. Nobody's paying attention to what's happening to the larger context. And I think that drive, that yang energy, is where coherence comes from, right? And I think hypercoherence is a real threat. It's a very short version of some philosophy stuff I've been working with.
And pulling that right back to basic, right? Like, one of the earliest moments of identifying an autistic kid is the hypercoherence thing. It's lining up all your toys. It's the trying to create order from chaos.
Because we are so overwhelmed by the fact that our expectations of reality are constantly defied. And so we lose trust in our ability to perceive order anywhere that we're not the ones creating. Where is that threshold located where somebody suddenly becomes autistic? And I had the thought a while back that you become autistic when other people lose the ability to predict you. That's what autism is.
According to the DSM-5, yes.
Right?
My lived experience of autism is not. It's the pathologized of autism.
Yes, that's the diagnostic. That's the pathologizing frame, right?
Yeah.
If other people can predict you, it doesn't matter if you're struggling to predict them. Right. Whatever. That's something else. We don't care. You're fine.
More importantly, you're not dangerous.
You're not, because you can be predicted. But the instant you assert enough of your own agency to become unpredictable, now we need a diagnosis. Now we need a label. Now it's a problem.
Right.
And that threshold is fully external, is the thing that I found really funny when it clicked into place for me. It's got nothing to do with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Myk, I promised I would keep this under an hour, and I've broken my promise. And the thing that is really alive for me is that I want to do a whole season of podcast episodes with just you. We can talk about that offline. But I feel like these conversations are thank you. And just being able to nerd out and just letting the conversation go where it goes is beautiful. I love this.
I appreciate you having me. I appreciate the kind words. Yeah, it's just so nice to be able to talk about all this stuff with people who get it, and for an audience who's going to be... I'm so often just screaming into the void on Twitter.
Now you get to scream into the void on a podcast. I like to end these with two questions. The first one is, what do you wish neurotypical people knew about autistic folks?
Nothing. I wish they didn't even know we existed. Let us
God, that's a beautiful answer.
and mysterious, and just leave us alone, because if they know about us, they feel the need to do something about us. So just what I wish they knew is there are many ways to be, and there's nothing wrong with any of them. Just accommodate people as they need to be accommodated.
And my final question, can you give me an example of a time that you were seen and loved in exactly the right way for you?
That gets into some stuff I don't really want to talk about.
You know what? I'm perfectly happy to let that be your answer.
Thank you.
You're amazing. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for setting it up. Look forward to seeing it when it comes out. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of the podcast. You can catch us on TikTok at AutisticFM, on Instagram at autistic_FM, and of course, join the discussion and suggest future guests at autistic.fm. While you're there, don't forget to subscribe for free and become a part of our vibrant community. This podcast is produced and hosted by yours truly, Haya Camps, and expertly edited by Sean Portillo. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here with me. Thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to having you along on our next episode.